So now let's go on to focus a little bit more on the reactions specific to aerobic metabolism. And by aerobic metabolism, I mean the reactions that are occurring in the mitochondria, namely the PDC, TCA cycle, and the electron transport chain. So we see a lot of times that decarboxylation is involved in catabolism type reactions, right? Where we lose CO2 as a gas, and that's an irreversible entropy driven process. So there are two types of keto acids that we will see, and they will each need to be decarboxylated at some point during either PDC or the TCA cycle. So this decarboxylation is fundamental, right? Because it's the complete oxidation of carbon, and all 6 carbons of glucose become carbon dioxide after the TCA cycle. So the first case is a beta keto acid. And here it's easy for it to decarboxylate. This is a reaction you learned in Chem 262.